Okay, now we're hopping into Chapter 15, and this is the practice set, participation set, however you want to look at it. These are the basics. Now we're doing job costs, so keep that in mind. Job cost and process cost both have the same fundamentals. We're going to use work in process, we're going to use finished goods, we're going to use cost of goods sold, we're going to use factory overhead, direct materials, and indirect materials. We just kind of put the numbers in different. So let's begin and start looking at it. So now we have a car that they have spent $10,000 on. Okay? So it started at, it had $10,000, $500 in work in process. They completed it. And we need to, they completed it, and then the driver or the owner paid $14,900 in cash. And they want us to record journal entries. Well, I'm not doing journal entries, I'm doing T accounts, simply because I think you see the flow better. So here we have $10,500 work in process. We're going to transfer that to finished goods. So transfer that to finished goods. We need to get it out of work in process. So we're done with work in process. Now I've got $10,500, and along comes the gentleman to pay for it. He pays me $14,900. That gets a debit to cash and a credit to sales. But I've got to get it out of here, and I have to get it into cost of goods sold, right? So first of all, I put it into cost of goods sold, and then I credit the finished goods. Now this will end up, right, on the income statement. This and this will end up on the income statement. It'll be $14,000 minus $10,500. That'll actually be the profit from that transaction. So that's kind of how it flows through. Let's do another one. This one, we are looking at raw material. And we purchased $50,000 in raw material for cash. So we're going to do that one right off the bat. And I'm going to credit cash, obviously. And we'll get overdrawn. We then used $12,000 of the raw material as indirect as factory supplies and $32,000 as direct materials. So what does that look like? Okay, let's do the $7,000 first. $17,000. And that's going to be a credit to get it out of raw materials and a debit to get it into factory overhead. The other is $32,000. But instead of going to factory overhead with this, I go to work in process now. So we now, how much is left in here? This is zero. This is a zero amount. My cash has been taken care of. My factory overhead will eventually be transferred over to work in process. So that's another example. And now, whoops, we're off the board with that, aren't we? During the current month, let's see, I'll make that a little bit smaller so we can get that. There you go. During the current month, we have a factory payroll of $180,000, and 40 of it is indirect, and 140 of it then would be direct. So how does this work out? Well, first of all, let's record this. We know that's a payable. And now I have factory overhead of $40,000 for indirect material. And I have work in process for $140,000 for direct labor. So this is indirect and this is direct. Clear as mud? Okay, let's do another one. Oh, now this one's fun because now we're going to start doing and working with applied overhead, which is something that we use to tack on overhead when we don't have the true overhead amount. And to do that, we use an overhead rate that is tied to something directly to the product. So, here's going to show us how to do this, how to create the rate. The company incurred the following manufacturing costs this period. Direct labor, $468, and direct materials, $390, and factory overhead was $116. And they want us to come up with a rate to use to apply that overhead to other jobs. So what we're going to do is divide that 1 by labor. If they were to use labor as their driver, it would be at a rate of 25% of labor. So when I take 117 and divide it by 468, I come up with 25%. So that means if I had labor, direct labor of 500,000, and I wanted to know how much overhead to apply to that $5,000, I would simply multiply 500,000 times 25%, and I would come up with an applied rate of overhead of $125,000. Let's do the same thing. Materials. You can use materials because it's a direct driver, so it's 117. Just whichever is closest and most representative of the product. And now if I divide 117 by 390, I come up with 30%. And that 30% would be used, again, if my materials became 400,000. And I wanted to know how to apply that overhead. I would use 30% and multiply it times $400,000 and come up with an applied overhead of $120,000. That kind of making sense as we go along? So let's try another one. And as we go along, so now we're looking at during the month, we need to move this over. During the current month, the company uses a job cost system incurring factory payroll of $175. Of this amount, 44 is classified as indirect and the remainder is direct labor. And they want to apply factory overhead is applied at 90% of direct labor. Prepare the journal entry to apply factory overhead to this job. Well, first of all, you got to figure out how much that is. So we have 175 in overall labor, but 44 of that is actually indirect. And the difference between that is, I don't know. That's why we have spreadsheets, right? So the difference is 131,000. Now, I'm going to multiply that times 90% to come up with the factory overhead. So that would equal 131 times 90 as $117,900. Now this is not true overhead, it's applied overhead. And there's a difference if you remember reading in the book. So how this plays out is, okay, I need to put, number one, I would put 130 in there, right, for direct labor. So that would be direct labor. And then for applied factory overhead, I would put there. I would put this 117,900. Now, here's a curious thing. Factory overhead is an expense, right? And usually factory overhead is debited. But in the case of applied, overhead, because it is applied and not true, that becomes a credit for. So the factory overhead. This over here is always going to be applied. Now, when we come back and we start applying overhead, it'll be on the left side, and you'll compare these two to find the over or under applied overhead as we go along. So this is applied. Remember, applied is debited and then credited here. So let's go on and do, now this one is asking us to estimate overhead the rate for overhead costs based on direct materials. So our overhead for the year is going to be $1,170,000 divided by direct materials of $900,000 to give us a rate of 130% when we apply that. And that will be done on all of the raw materials that are used. And we'll multiply that times whatever the raw materials is to come up with our factory overhead, applied factory overhead. So hang in there. So now, what do we got? Okay, here's applied factory overhead that's been recorded, and here's the actual overhead that has been recorded. So if you compare these two, you'll notice they aren't quite right. It's not perfect. There's a balance. I need another, and I need this to be 0, okay? And what will happen is you'll go along applying factory overhead, and if it's a very small amount, as compared to the overall cost, you're just going to apply this to the cost of goods sold. So I'm at the end of the period, and I look up and I find out, oh my gosh, I have $22,000. There's a difference of $22,000 here. This is what I've applied already, but this is what I should have applied. So this is called over-applied overhead. And I need to get that into my cost system. So what you end up doing is you're going to debit, now watch, I'm just going to debit for $22,000. And that's a debit. And I'm going to credit or lower my cost of goods sold, because I've applied too much in that when I applied all that overhead to the jobs. So that's going to reduce my cost of goods sold, right? And increase my profit. This is probably very confusing, so just hang in there a little bit. So we've over-applied that, right? So these numbers need to go away. You don't want those numbers in there. So here's another one, and I need to move this. It keeps moving around on me. A company allocates overhead rate at $150,000 on direct, 150% for direct labor. The actual overhead cost for the current period is $950. So actual goes here. How much have they allocated? Okay, how much has been allocated for this? So it's 150% of 600,000. And if we do 150%, that should come up with about 900,000, I think. I guess I better add that out just to make sure, or multiply that out. Equals 9 times 15. So the applied is only 900,000. It should have been 50,000. What does that say? I've under-applied my factory overhead by $50,000. So now, instead of debiting, right, I'm going to credit the factory overhead and debit cost of goods sold. That's going to increase and take care of that under-applied overhead that exists right now. Making sense? Okay, we're going to keep going. Here is number 11, and this is just applying costs. So I have materials for job 1 at 5,000. I have materials at 7,000 for job 2, and I have materials at 1,500 for job 3. And they're asking us what are they asking us? Compute the amount of overhead applied for each of these 3 jobs. Well, if I multiply that times what, 40%? It looks like I should be able to come up with an answer for that. And that is just a straight calculation. And that would be equal this times this. And there become what would be applied to those jobs. See how that works? So if we look at 12, we are going to kind of do the same thing. We're going to apply. And direct materials used for job 1 are 5,000. You hear my puppy throwing a fit in the back? And 1,500. Here you go. Direct labor was 9,000, 4,000, and 3,000. Now, what do we do with the factory overhead? It is 40% of direct labor costs. So this equals this times 0.40. So I have $2,000 there, and I'm just going to copy these across, guys. And then all I have to do is add them up. So equals SUM here. Going to add these up. And this should give us how much each one of these, what their job card is going to be. You have 16,000 for 1, 13,800 for 2, and 5,100 for job 3. And what was the last thing? Then they ask us, what is the total amount in work in process, and what is the total amount in finished goods? And I'm going to let you figure that out and bring to class on Friday. How's that? And in 13, you should be able now to do the same thing. See if you can pull this off. And this is where we'll pick up on Friday. And we'll also do the homework for Chapter 14. So what you need to do is listen to the 2 videos and then watch the 3 videos here for Chapter 14 and 15. And we will be good to go for Friday. Thank you. Have a great day.